Presenting from the Great Plains Television Studios in Wichita, Kansas, Kansas Living with Rick Lorino.
Welcome to our show today. With me today is Ed Trimmer, a Democratic representative from Winfield, Marc Rhoades, a Republican representative from Newton, and Bob Weeks, WichitaLiberty.org. And we're going to be talking about a topic which should be interesting to all of us because it affects all of us in one way or another, and that is, what is the role of government? And then we're going to talk about the legislative session that just occurred up in Topeka. Ed, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, Rick, I was initiated into the legislature 8 years ago. I didn't come in on a regular election cycle. The lady whose place I took had cancer and asked me to take her place for a year. And so I had the pleasure of running for election without any campaign experience, but with a voting record. So that was interesting.
That's pretty interesting.
And it's turned out to be a good experience. I really enjoy it most of the time. There are times that it's a pretty frustrating experience, but I represent Winfield, but I also represent Northern Cali County, which includes Udall, Rock, Kansas. I used to have Burden, Atlanta, Cambridge, and I used to have Butler County, like Leon, Latham, Beaumont, the eastern Butler County area. But in the last apportionment, I moved to Sumner County, and now I represent Oxford and Belle Plaine and all the area in between.
Marc Rhoades, Republican, up north here in Newton. Tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Okay. Born and raised in Newton. Went to K-State and then moved to D.C. Worked in the Reagan White House for his last term. Worked on Capitol Hill. And then started our family. And then met my wife there in D.C. And then we moved back in 1996.
She had culture shock, didn't she?
Actually, we were married in 85, and we came back often for a couple weeks every year for vacation, and our kids did. And so my folks still live in Newton and really enjoy Newton. She really loves Newton and loves, Kansas. Absolutely.
That's super.
Absolutely. So, and then ran for the legislature. I worked at Tabor College in the business department, business instructor for a number of years. I was assistant director on the Wichita campus. I've done a number of different things. I've owned businesses, but ran for the legislature in 2006, basically the year of the November, and won election that year and came in 2007. So
super. And Bob, what's your background? What's WichitaLiberty.org?
Well, it's just a blog like Michelle Malkin. I'm just a blogger there. But no, most of my life I've been a software engineer. I grew up in Wichita, went to school at KU. I lived in Chicago for about 6 years after that, but then came back to Wichita. And I really wasn't involved that much in politics. I was always interested in news and things, but in 2004, almost 10 years ago, there was a ballot issue here in Wichita, Sedgwick County in particular, having to do with a sales tax for the arena that's now known as the Interest Bank Arena. And I thought that the local news media, in particular the Wichita Eagle, if I can say that, was really not covering the issues that needed to be covered. And that's what kind of got me started. Because I was familiar with computers, internet, and things like that, it became natural and easy for me to express myself through a blog on the internet. And I think people who know me know I'm much more comfortable with a keyboard than talking to people anyway. So that's how I got started on that. Then a few years ago, the company I worked for, we went through some changes and I got downsized out of my job. So I just do a little bit of freelance work in information technology and spend a lot of time on my blogging and activism and things like that.
So you're politically active. You're the kind of citizen that most of us should be but aren't.
Well, I don't think so. I think you wouldn't want everybody to be obsessed like I am, Rick. I don't think so.
Well, the topic that I want to start out discussing with all three of you is, what is the role of government? And I'm sure each of us sitting around this table have a different idea of what that role should be. And you can talk about the federal role, but I'm more interested in what's the state role of government. That's really what I want to focus in on if we can. And Marc, why don't you tell us what from your perspective and the Republican Party perspective is the role of government?
Sure. Well, I think it starts with the people and not with the government, if I can say it like that.
Sure.
I think a lot of times people get confused with calling us a democracy, and in that sense, I think the federal system and the state system are the same. We're a democratic republic. We're right, and the difference is that we, whether it's the state level, local level, or the federal level, we put people in office to represent them. I mean, I often tell people that, and I think Representative Trimmer would agree with this, there's no way for me to know on 300 votes that we take every session where 51% of my district is.
Sure.
Right? So that's really what a republic does. It's a representative that says, okay, here's where I stand on these issues. And then I think people do put trust in that person to send them wherever, whether it's federal or state, to make, those decisions. And then if they didn't tell the truth, or somebody said, oops, he was more this way than that way, they have the opportunity to vote them out. But for me, I think the role of government is really starts with the people, ends with the people. It's really the people being represented in a group, basically, to make decisions for the body.
The Republican Party is on the path, or at least it looked like in this last legislative session, of reducing the size of government. Mm-hmm. Would that be a fair statement on my part?
I think that's certainly the Republicans' desire and our hope. I think I told you I worked for Ronald Reagan. One of the disappointing things for me for Ronald Reagan, as much as I enjoyed working for him, was that many times, even though you come in with certain principles, in the case of low taxes, generate business, et cetera, if the spending isn't kept down, right, then that's problematic. And unfortunately, he ended up spending quite a bit. So I think it has to be both of those things if you're really talking about limited government. And I'll give you one real quick example because I think those are helpful. We can talk about generalities. It's really, in my opinion, it's not a positive, negative thing. Sometimes it's the thing of we just forget. I'll give a good case in point, CanEd. A number of years ago, we looked at that, and it was through the KUSF where we were spending about $10 million per year for this. And the whole initial idea, and Ed might remember when that came in, but I can't remember. But when it was started, it was just a tax on everybody's phone, right, to bring broadband connectivity to the rural area, right, which is awesome, something we want. I think that's a lofty goal, sure, and a very positive goal. So we all wanted that. But what ends up happening a lot of times with government is something begins, people forget about what it is, and it maybe morphs into something that it was, or it's outlived its usefulness. In the case of the CanEd, we had thousands of hospitals, schools, et cetera, that had T1 lines that we were paying, the state was paying about $890 per month for. Yeah. Nobody was using them.
Yeah, and T1 is the highest level you're going to get, and most people don't need a T1.
Well, and what we found is CanRan, who kind of does the university system, they need a lot more bandwidth, et cetera. Court Buffington and some of the folks there really did a look at the statewide situation and realized they didn't need it. Right. And so it's just a good example. I don't think it's a he's bad, this is bad. No. It's not really that at all for me. It's, are we spending the money that we're spending well, efficiently, and are there things that have outgrown their usefulness?
Okay, so I think I know where your position is.
Sure.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come right back with Ed Trimmer and give him his turn to talk about what government's role is. Welcome back, and we're going to pick up that discussion that we were having before we went to break with Ed Trimmer, talking about what the role of government here in Kansas is. So Ed, it's your turn.
Well, Rick, I think that government needs to provide things that ordinarily wouldn't happen if there was no government. Public safety is certainly one of the most important things. You have to have police protection, you have to have fire protection, You have to have a correctional system for people who are bad actors, and those are very important.
Vigilante
components.
justice won't work.
Well, it's been tried, but sometimes the wrong people get punished. We have education, which is a major part. We provide public education, and that's really critical because we're one of the few countries that has a public education system where anyone, no matter how poor they are, can get a good education if they apply themselves.
Right.
Having had a daughter who taught in Mexico for a couple of years, we saw how if you have money, you can get an education. If you don't, you're in a classroom of 80 kids, and the teacher hasn't been paid for 6 months. So
I understand.
Those issues. We also have infrastructure, roads, highways. Those are things that are not necessarily cost effective to maintain other than, having the government provide those. I mean, those are good things that they provide for us. And finally, public health and the health of its citizens. One of the things they talk about, you hear, I think the gauge of a nation is how they treat the people least able to take care of themselves or people who are ill. And I think not that you want to provide, everything for everybody, but at some point it is, to our benefit, really more economical to make sure that we don't have a lot of people clogging emergency rooms, that we don't have a lot of people becoming ill, that we don't have widespread diseases that were not controlled. And so those are functions like the government.
From your perspective, the role of government is to take care of those big structural things that no one individual could probably do on their own.
Right.
Okay, Bob, you're up. What's the role of government from your perspective?
Well, I believe I was invited to be on this show to provide a libertarian's perspective, and I will say that I am an active member of the Republican Party. There is a Libertarian Party, but a lot of libertarians choose to make their political home in the Republican Party for a variety of reasons. Probably most prominently is that at the federal level in most states, a third party just isn't really viable as far as getting candidates elected. So libertarians, there's a great deal of diversity of thought, but most libertarians subscribe to something very fundamental called the non-aggression axiom, and that's a big word. David Bose of the Cato Institute puts it much simpler. He says, don't hit people and don't take their stuff. That's primarily what libertarians believe in. A difference between libertarians and other schools of thought is that we also apply that to government at all levels as well.
Okay.
We say taxation is hitting people, and well, it's taking their stuff, and if you don't want to give it up, the government's going to hit you. So that's where libertarians split off from, I think, our two major parties.
Many people would say that government sometimes picks winners and losers. And I'm not sure whether that's right or wrong, but legislatively we tend to make laws that benefit some people and hurt others, bottom line. So we have some divergence in maybe what government should be. Some people want government to take care of their every need, and others want it to just be there and take care of the big things and leave the rest of us alone. But I know, like in private education, which I was involved with for 33 years, we had a state licensing agency, and that state agency was the gatekeeper to the federal funds and so forth, and controlled who got to be a school and who couldn't be a school, and at what level you provided education. So in many cases, state and local governments choose winners and losers through the legislative process. Let's talk.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I didn't know if this is a jump in if you want to.
Sure, it's a jump in if you want to.
All right, and I guess I want to say that I think there's a lot of gray area here when we talk about the role of government. I wouldn't disagree with Representative Trimmer on anything that he said. I really wouldn't.
Okay.
I think human nature plays into it sometimes and causes things to get bigger. And that's just the natural tendency. If doing this much is good, then doing this much is better. And I think we in government, it's really finding what the balance is. Where is the balance on the amount of what we spend or don't spend? I mean, a good example is England. England just now took like half the people off their disability rolls because they couldn't afford it. because there began to be all forms of, well, what is disabled, and the list grew of who would
Well, it's
qualify.
just like what you were talking about with broadband. A little bit of broadband's good. A lot of broadband must be better. So we'll give everybody a T1
Sure.
line and lots of broadband. The problem is that government tends to grow.
It does.
In and of itself. Would you agree with that, Ed?
Well, in some cases, yes. And being on the Rules and Regulations Committee, which is a joint committee between the House and the Senate, what I think is disturbing is we will pass laws, but it's the administrative side of the government then takes what we pass, and they're given tasks to create rules and regulations to administer those. And a lot of times what ends up coming out of that process is not anything that we intended. And there's a tendency, and I've seen it in all administrations, for an agency to want to grow and to want to increase fees, etc. Now, I am a little bothered now because I think what's happened because of our tax situation, I'm seeing a real propensity for agencies to increase user fees. So, for instance, the licensing of the beauty schools is going to skyrocket because
absolutely.
That's the way it's going to be done.
And that's how they get more money for their budget.
And that money gets swept into the state general fund, right?
Right.
And so, I'm disturbed by that. Now, what I would say is sometimes government reacts in a way that's positive, and sometimes it has to grow. We talked about laissez-faire economics during the 1800s, and we ended up with robber barons. Yeah. And had we not done something about that, we would have had all of the wealth concentrated in the hands of maybe 3 or 4 huge,
individuals.
Right, individuals. Yeah, very wealthy individuals. And so there are times at which we don't like it, but as you said, don't hit people. Sometimes hitting people comes in lots of different ways, and we have to be
Since
cautious.
we brought up the evil robber barons, I think if we look at the course of history, when John Rockefeller started Standard Oil, kerosene was very expensive, could only be afforded by very wealthy people. By the time he got up and running, he reduced the price of kerosene many times. Everybody then could have oil lamps.
And I don't think the government ever said you can't produce kerosene and you can't be competitive. I think what they said was you can't drive your competitors out of business.
And he drove them out of business by learning how to refine and transport oil more cheaply, more efficiently than the others, and he bought out his competitors.
Well, and that's true to an extent, but there was a point at which he coerced a lot of his competitors. And the railroad barons, when they would not allow someone to be in business unless they shipped from them or they paid certain prices for things that they dictated, there are times when business curbs competition, and a big enough business can curb competition. So you really can't allow all businesses to have total laissez-faire economics. That
doesn't work.
Right,
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
There has to be some government overarching to keep a level and fair playing
But
field.
as I was saying, the tendency is to overregulate. The
Absolutely.
tendency is for an agency to get their fingers into more things, and it doesn't matter the administration.
So how do we attack that problem?
Well, one of the things that we actually do is the Rules and Regs Committee does look at those things and make recommendations on how to stop some of the things that happen. And legislative, we can go back and deal with that. But
we end up going back and fixing some of those sometimes. A law is put in, they get it wrong, we go back in and say, okay, here's what we really meant,
But we do have, and that's why the committee is an oversight.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Well, this last legislative session was pretty exciting, and what I think we ought to do now is go to a commercial break, and we'll come back and get into the last legislative session and all of the happenings here in Kansas. Welcome back. We're going to now start into the legislative session and so forth, but I think the first question we need to talk about a little bit is the size of government. And Bob, you haven't had the chance to go first, so let's give you the opportunity this time to express what your opinions are on the size of government.
Well, I think, in my opinion, much too large, and I think that was the opinion of the legislature this year too, because what came out is a tax bill that's going to increase the amount of money flowing into government over the next 5 years, starting next year. So obviously the legislature, at least the majority of it, and the governor thought government was not big enough, didn't take in enough revenue.
didn't take in enough revenue, so the government is going to grow.
Yes.
Okay. Mark, what do you think?
Well, I'm the chair of appropriations, and I can tell you that we shrunk the size of government at least $105 million this year. I think when you talk about the role of government, though, it's really difficult for a part-time legislature to really do that on their own. It really is. At the end of the day, the governor, whoever he or she is, has to be the driving force to say, okay, Department of Commerce, what are your roles? What are your tasks? And are you doing them well? Do we need 10 programs, if they're, to simplify it for the math's sake, or Department of Administration or Department of Agriculture? So when we go in for a 75-day mega session and then come back for a veto session, it's really difficult, I would say impossible, and ludicrous, really, when you think about it, for us to come in, 165 of us, and make a decision of $14 billion when we don't live with those budgets. We make a decision in 75 days.
But aren't there committees that are ongoing during the
interim
year?
Committees are there are a few, but interim committees still do not give you the opportunity. If I was up there 2 days a week, if Ed were up there 2 days a week and we were trying to drill down into some things, maybe. So it really is incumbent. I mean, one of the things I'd like to see happen is a zero-based budget model for all state government. What that means, we asked this year for them to give us, every agency to give us, what are your core programs that you do, what do they cost, and why do you need them? And but that's just the starting point. Really, the governor should be doing that. Ed?
Well, I think when you talk about large government or government growing, it depends on what you mean by that, because I think that's a nebulous term.
Okay.
It's great for the campaign because It sounds like it's something, but it really isn't. You have to say, are you talking about spending? Are you talking about number of employees? Are you talking about services? What are you encompassing? Now, I think we have a problem in that we've cut spending because of the 2012 tax plan. We have an unfair tax system right now where if an attorney, makes millions of dollars, he doesn't pay a dime in taxes, but yet his secretary pays taxes. Now, income tax. That's really a shift in who pays what.
Who pays what,
right?
Sure.
And that's problematic. But it's cut revenues. It's cut revenues by 2015 or 18 by almost $5 billion. Now that's making government smaller. But what we've ended up with is go to the DMV right now and try to get a license and not wait 5 and 6 hours.
I'm going to stop you right there. This is a fascinating topic, and we're just scratching the surface. So if you're interested in what we've been talking about, what I'm going to encourage you to do is tune in next week to Kansas Living on KGPT. This is Rick Loreno, and we'll see you next week.